The summer heat shimmered on the pavement as I stood on the front porch, staring at my stepdad's car parked in the driveway. The old sedan sat there like a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready for. My hands were already clammy, my stomach twisting with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't excitement either. I had been putting this off for weeks. "You need to learn how to drive, kid," he had said last night over dinner, his deep voice calm but firm. "You're almost 18. It's about time." I knew he was right. But it wasn't the driving itself that made me hesitate. It was the idea of spending time alone with him, just the two of us. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint gasoline scent that clung to his clothes whenever he worked on the car. Inside, my mom was busy with something, her laughter drifting from the kitchen as she spoke on the phone. She had been happy when he offered to teach me. "It'll be good for you two," she had said, smiling in that way that made me feel like I should be grateful. And I was, or at least I told myself I was. The screen door creaked open behind me, and then his voice followed. "You ready?" I turned to face him. My stepdad, Jake, was standing there in his usual worn jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, arms crossed, waiting for my answer. The sunlight hit his face just right, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the streaks of early gray in his dark hair. He wasn't old, not really, but he carried himself with a quiet authority that made it easy to forget he wasn't my real dad. I swallowed. "Yeah, I think so." His lips curved in something between a smirk and a smile. "We'll see about that." He tossed me the keys and I caught them, barely. Something in his gaze lingered a moment too long before he turned toward the car, his fingers brushing against mine as he stepped past. It was nothing. A second, maybe less. But my breath hitched. Anyway, I shook it off, forcing my feet to move. The afternoon sun bore down on us as I climbed into the driver's seat, the leather scalding against my skin. The scent of his cologne, faint but undeniable, lingered in the enclosed space. He shut the passenger door beside me. The sound echoed louder than I expected. "All right," he said, voice lower now that we were inside, closer. "Let's start with the basics." I gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. This was normal, completely normal. So why did it feel like something was about to happen? The car rumbled beneath my grip as I turned the key in the ignition. My stepdad, Jake, watched me carefully, his elbow resting on the center console, one hand draped casually over his knee. He looked at ease, but there was something in his posture that made me hyper-aware of every move I made. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Foot on the brake." I obeyed. "Now, put it in drive." I did. The car inched forward, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The neighborhood stretched out ahead, the golden hue of the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. I could hear kids playing somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic creak of a porch swing, the faint hum of a lawnmower. Normal, everyday sounds. But inside the car, the silence between us was thick, charged. "You're gripping the wheel, too. Hard," Jake said, reaching over to nudge my hand. "Relax. Driving's all about control, not tension." His fingers barely brushed against mine, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I swallowed hard, nodding as I loosened my grip. We drove in slow loops around the block, his instructions smooth and measured. Ease into the turns. Don't overcorrect. I could feel his eyes on me, studying the way I moved, the way I reacted. Every time he leaned in, whether to adjust the wheel or point something out, I felt my pulse quicken. I told myself it was just nerves. But deep down, I knew better. After half an hour, he directed me toward the outskirts of town, where the roads were quieter. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. The car's interior had warmed, making the air thick and heavy. "You're getting the hang of it," Jake said, nodding in approval. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Yeah, it's not as bad as I thought." He chuckled. "Told you." For a while it felt normal. Just a lesson. Just a stepdad teaching his son how to drive. Then the storm came. It started with a single drop on the windshield, then another. Within minutes, the sky darkened, and rain began to hammer against the glass in heavy sheets. The wipers struggled to keep up, and the road ahead blurred into a haze of gray. Jake shifted in his seat. "All right, let's pull over. For a bit." I nodded and guided the car to the side of the road, my knuckles white against the wheel. The storm roared outside, the wind shaking the car slightly as we sat in silence. "You okay?" he asked. I exhaled sharply. "Yeah, just wasn't expecting that. Storms come out of nowhere around here." He ran a hand through his damp hair, the rain making the air feel cooler inside the car. "You did good, though." I turned toward him, and for the first time our eyes met. Really met. His gaze held something unreadable, something that made my stomach tighten. The rain drummed against the roof, a steady rhythmic beat that filled the space between us. I knew I should look away. I knew I should say something, anything, to break the tension, but I didn't. Jake cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "We should wait it out." "Yeah," I murmured. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The world outside was a blur of water and motion, isolating us in this small, enclosed space. My thoughts raced, memories of fleeting touches, of glances that lasted too long, of moments that felt like something more but couldn't be, shouldn't be. I swallowed hard, trying to push it all down, trying to remind myself that this was just a driving lesson, just a storm. But then he spoke, his voice lower this time. "You've been acting different lately." I tensed. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I don't know, just distant." I forced a laugh. "I've just been busy." Jake studied me, his expression unreadable. "You sure?" I nodded quickly. Too quickly. Another moment of silence, another breath too heavy, too loaded with meaning. Then, suddenly, a knock on the window. I jolted, my heart leaping into my throat. A man stood outside, barely visible through the rain. His face was shadowed, his features distorted by the water streaming down the glass. Jake frowned, rolling down the window just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" The man leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable. "Car trouble?" Jake shook his head. "Just waiting out the storm." The man hesitated, his gaze flickering toward me. For some reason, a chill ran down my spine. There was something off about him. Something in the way he lingered just a little too long, the way his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well," the man said after a pause, "be careful out here." And then, just like that, he turned and disappeared into the rain. Jake rolled up the window, locking the doors out of instinct. "That was weird." I let out a shaky breath. "Yeah." The rain continued to pour, but suddenly it felt colder inside the car. Something had shifted. Something I couldn't name. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. The world outside. The car was a blur of water and shadow, the road barely visible through the fogged-up windshield. The wipers groaned against the glass, fighting a losing battle against the storm. Inside the car, it was quiet. Too quiet. Jake shifted in his seat, rubbing a hand over his jaw. His knuckles were tight, his fingers flexing and curling as if trying to work out some tension he wasn't saying out loud. I could feel it. The weight of something unspoken, something hovering between us like the thick, rain-soaked air. I tried to focus on my breathing, tried to convince myself that this was just a moment of stillness, that nothing had changed. But something had. "You all right?" Jake asked. His voice was low, rough in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah, fine." He exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. "That guy back there, he gave me a bad feeling." I swallowed. "Yeah," a beat of silence. Then, You ever feel like something's about to happen? Jake asked, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. What do you mean? He hesitated. Like a moment. Like you can feel it before it even happens. I didn't know what to say to that. Because I did feel it. Right now. Right here. The tension in the car had changed, stretched thin like a wire about to snap. I tried to shake it off. Maybe we should head back. Jake didn't answer. Not right away. He turned to me instead, his gaze locking onto mine. His eyes were dark, unreadable, filled with something I couldn't name. And then, the headlights of another car flared through the rain. Jake jerked forward, twisting to look over his shoulder. The vehicle was coming up behind us fast, its high beams cutting through the downpour like knives. It wasn't just passing by, it was stopping. A cold dread coiled in my stomach. Jake's posture changed instantly, tense, alert. His hand moved toward the gear shift. Stay here. Before I could say anything, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the rain. The storm swallowed him instantly. Water streamed down his face, his clothes darkening as he squared his shoulders and turned toward the approaching car. I could barely make out the figure stepping out of the other vehicle. It was the man from before. Even through the rain, I could see the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like he wasn't in a hurry, like he had all the time in the world. Jake took a step forward. Hey, something you need? The man didn't answer. I gripped the edges of my seat, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Something wasn't right. The man tilted his head slightly, rain dripping down his face. Then finally he spoke. Just making sure you're okay. Jake didn't move. We're fine, the man smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was sharp, cold, and then he reached inside his jacket. My stomach dropped. Jake reacted instantly, stepping between me and the man, his entire body tense. Hey, back. Off! The man's hand stilled. He looked at Jake for a long moment, then, just as slowly, he pulled his hand back into view. Empty. But the message was clear. Jake didn't move until the man gave a small, knowing smirk, then turned and walked back to his car. A second later, the headlights cut through the rain, and the vehicle sped off into the night. The moment it was gone, Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. Then without a word, he climbed back into the car. The door slammed shut. Silence. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was our breathing, too fast, too unsteady. I turned to him. What the hell was that? Jake shook his head, staring straight ahead. His jaw was tight, his grip on the wheel white-knuckled. I don't know. But I could see it in his eyes. He knew. And whatever it was, it had just changed everything. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. The rain continued to pound against the windshield, each drop hitting like a tiny drumbeat, a countdown to something I didn't understand yet. Jake's hands were still gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. His breathing was shallow, controlled, but barely. I could feel the energy radiating off him, the silent battle waging inside his head. I swallowed hard. Jake. He didn't answer. I tried again. Who was that guy? This time, he exhaled, through his nose, shaking his head like he was trying to clear it. Doesn't matter. But, he turned to me suddenly, his gaze sharp, intense. I said it doesn't matter. I flinched at the edge in his voice, but I didn't look away, because I knew it did matter. That encounter wasn't random. That man wasn't just some guy. And Jake? He knew exactly what was going on. The car felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. The weight of unspoken words sat heavy between us, pressing against my chest. Jake ran a hand over his face, his fingers lingering at his temple. He looked exhausted, not just from tonight, but from something deeper, something he had been carrying long before I ever got into this car with him. I hesitated before asking, "Are we in trouble?" Jake let out a humorless laugh. "Depends," On what you mean by trouble. I waited, hoping he would say more, but he didn't. Instead, he reached for the ignition. We need to get out of here. The car roared to life, headlights cutting through the storm as he pulled onto the road. I watched the darkness swallow us whole, my fingers gripping the seatbelt strap across my chest. I wanted to believe this was over. That we were just two people trying to outrun the storm. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't over. Not even close. The road stretched ahead of us, endless and empty, swallowed by the night. The storm had begun to ease, but my heart was still, racing. The encounter, the tension, the weight of whatever had just happened, it sat between us like a ghost neither of us could acknowledge. Jake kept his eyes fixed on the road, his grip still tight on the wheel. His jaw was set, his posture rigid like he was waiting for something, or maybe bracing for it. I swallowed hard. You knew him, didn't you? Silence. A long beat passed before Jake let out a slow breath. Doesn't matter. There it was again, the same dismissive answer. The same refusal to let me in, but I wasn't letting this go. You're lying, I said, my voice firmer now, and I think you're scared. Jake's fingers twitched against the wheel, a barely noticeable reaction, but I caught it. I'm not scared, he muttered. Another lie. I turned toward him, studying his face in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. There was something haunted in his expression, something that hadn't been there before. I pressed forward. Jake, what aren't you telling me? He didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick with something unspoken, something dangerous. Then, a pair of headlights flickered in the rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. Jake's entire body tensed. The car behind us wasn't just driving past. It was following us. The same car, the same man. I barely had time to react before Jake's foot slammed down on the gas pedal. The engine roared and we shot forward, the tires kicking up water as we sped down the highway. Panic gripped my chest. Jake, hold on, he said, his voice tight. I turned in my seat, watching as the headlights behind us gained speed. Who was this guy? What did he want? The road stretched ahead, empty except for the two of us. The storm had passed, but the real danger had just begun. And for the first time since this night started, I had the sinking feeling that neither of us were getting out of this unscathed.